It's a weird city, and that's one of the reasons why things like the Universal Studios tour could exist and why Disneyland could be invented. Only really in Los Angeles could that be.
When it first opened in 1955, Disneyland was the ultimate fantasy land. Its creator, Walt Disney, envisioned it as a place where his pen and ink movies would take physical form, where families could experience his timeless stories as three-dimensional worlds.
To all who come to this happy place, welcome.
There was three parts about Walt Disney that fascinated me. His core expertise was a cartoonist, right? And that's what he was doing.
Yeah.
And if Walt Disney would have just stayed as a cartoonist, and he was a great cartoonist, probably none of us would remember Walt Disney. His other talent was, as he transitioned and formed the Walt Disney Company, he ended up being a really smart business person and a manager, right?
Yeah.
So he had this incredible creative side. He had this incredible other side of his brain that was a business side, right? But even those two together, we probably wouldn't have remembered him. The third component that really made Walt Disney is he had vision. He had this ability to see around corners, to understand what people wanted, to tap into their lives and to make that emotional connection, and then the courage and the strength and the determination to make it happen, against all odds. Really, at the time, against all odds.
Right.
So to have the combination of the creativity, the business mind, and the vision, I think he's a great example of an American phenomenon who changed the world in ways that nobody would have ever predicted.
Walt Disney was always looking over the horizon of success for his next golden opportunity. I wanted to learn more about how the producer of groundbreaking and wildly popular animated films made the leap into an entirely new kind of business. So I visited the Walt Disney Archives in Burbank and sat down with their director, Rebecca Klein.
Children, and presumably adults too, wanted to see where the magic was made, but unfortunately for logistical reasons, Disney never offered tours of its studio, unlike other film studios?
The original Disney studios, the first one was in Hollywood. It was just a little storefront over near Vermont in Hollywood. And then there was a studio that was built, they called the Hyperion Studio, which was on Hyperion and Griffith Park Boulevard.
It's at Gelson's now, right?
Yeah, it's at Gelson's now, exactly. And that one is where Snow White was first, animated, and also Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck were both born there. That studio, we outgrew it almost immediately. And so in 1939, with the profits from Snow White, we were able to build this studio here in Burbank. And so when we built this studio, almost immediately, people were reading about the brand new Burbank studio and the Disney studios over the hill. And people started writing to the studio and writing to Walt and saying, we want to come see where Snow White lives and where Mickey Mouse lives. He knew that it would be really hard on the staff to have visitors coming through while they were working in the cramped quarters that even here they had. And it would be really hard for them to do that. And so he started thinking, how can I, share this with the public, how we make this magic? And that's actually what gave Walt the inspiration originally to start thinking about what he termed a kiddie park. It eventually morphed into something bigger, and they announced plans to make a park. And by that time they realized that plot was much too small. So they started looking south and ended up in Orange County and found the land in Anaheim. So they never did do tours of the studio. So this is a really special piece. This is here in the archives. One of our documents is the prospectus that they used to get investors for Disneyland.
Wow.
And so what this is it's this aerial schematic. This is a print of what Disneyland looked like in their imagination. Walt and Herb Ryman.
So Disney didn't draw this himself?
No, Herb Ryman, one of his Imagineers, one of the artists here at the studio, did it with Walt standing over his shoulder.
They built it in a year, right?
In 1 year,
That's
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
They couldn't do that today.
No way. But they did it, and so they had artwork. So the animators here at the studio, the illustrators here, drew what they envisioned each land would look like. So the very first guidebook doesn't have any photographs in it; it just has illustrations.
So in order to create Disneyland, Walt Disney had to, in a sense, invent a new profession, the Imagineer.
Right.
How did this come about?
He took some of his animators and people that were already working on animated films, very famous Imagineers like John Hench and Ken Anderson and Mark Davis. They were all working on animated films previously, but Walt knew they had this vision that they could make this happen. And so it was the vision of an art director who was used to creating scenic elements to give you that dimensional feel that you were walking into a movie was the idea.
It's architecture that tells a story.
Exactly. It's storytelling through architecture. And so a traditional architect didn't really get that, but he had these wonderful art directors who could work with the structural, engineers and architects. Some amazingly talented men and women that worked with Walt in the beginning on Disneyland, because most of Disneyland was constructed here on the lot and trucked down to Disneyland.
Really?
People don't really realize that.
No.
Who were these fabled Imagineers who turned two-dimensional sketches into three-dimensional living stories? I wanted to meet one for myself. So I visited Disney legend Bob Gurr, the man behind the monorail and many of the ride vehicles at the Disney theme parks, to learn how he and his fellow Imagineers made a magic world feel real.
How did you become an Imagineer?
They needed somebody to do a body for a little car. They had a little chassis in the back lot, needed a car body. The way he finds people is usually asking other people. Now he had several guys in the studio that were movie directors and animators, and they were car guys, and they knew who I was. So I come in as the car guy. And that immediately led to Walt has ideas for more stuff, including cars. It was one thing after another for all those years, because Walt wanted #1, Autopia, Main Street Vehicles, Omnibus. And then in 1959, he wanted the monorail, the Matterhorn, the submarine, a motorboat, and a new Autopia car. All 5 of those projects done in the same year.
Wow. And I worked at Disneyland, and I actually drove some of the very vehicles that I believe you designed. I drove the fire engine. I drove the horseless carriage, which I believe is nicknamed the Gurmobile. If I'm right about that.
Yes.
Yeah, and you designed those.
Yes, all the Main Street vehicles. We had the red car, the yellow car, we had 2 omnibuses, and then I talked Walt Disney into doing the fire engine, because I secretly wanted a fire engine.
I remember we were always told that it was such a privilege to drive that because it was Walt Disney's favorite vehicle.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And those cars are still in service today, 60 years later.
Yes.
It's impressive.
Well, it's because, remember, it's because it's standard store-bought parts. In other words, from the radiator, the engine, flywheel out, transmission, drive shaft, rear axle, out to the brakes, the stock parts. It just looks old.
So why was it so important to make it look, antique?
Okay, first off, it's Disneyland. Main Street is roughly 1900 to 1905, right in that area. You remember, Walt's telling stories. And when you do stories, you need to do it right. It needs to be historically correct. And look at all the architects, all the set designers, look what they did with Main Street. So when I was asked to design the vehicles, I could see automatically what are the things you need to do as far as a vehicle design that is authentic to anybody who really understands historic cars. It might take a little more time, cost a little bit more, but I just couldn't see doing it any other way than doing it just like Walt said, just get it right.
So Main Street USA sort of creates this, you walk down Main Street, you get the sense that you're in, well, sort of a nostalgic reimagining of a turn-of-the-century small town.
Yeah, you got to remember, Walt went from cartoons, movies, television. Now we're in a literally 3D walk-around in the park. So every detail, the storefronts, the colors, the little decorations, all of that has to be completely correct. And then when you put vehicles that are modern equipment, they have to look exactly to fit that architecture and that theme design.
And that's the primary job of an Imagineer?
Yes, yes. He only collected people that were curious. I mean, this is absurd to ask somebody to do something that requires engineers, but he didn't care. He grabbed people who could figure out what he wanted and how to do it. Look at all the people that it takes to make a movie. You've got writers, you've got set designers, you have costume, all of these things to tell a story. Walt was collecting people from all over in 1954, 55. We're going to design literally a movie story, but it's going to be a tangible movie story that the guests can go in and not so much walk around, the guests can be part of that story. A lot of people miss that point.
There are important differences between both places. But whenever I visit Rick Caruso's Grove, I'm reminded of my childhood strolls down Disneyland's Main Street, USA. Southern California's fascination with Fantasylands is alive and well today.